And now back to our story on the tobacco industry's attempts to use trade relations to derail the government's plans for plain packaging of cigarettes. Just a short time ago, I spoke to the Health Minister Nicola Roxon, who was in our Brisbane studio. Minister, welcome to Lateline.
Good evening.
We've heard tonight that a former US ambassador to the World Trade Organization, Peter Allgeier, has been actively lobbying Malaysia to pressure Australia not to go ahead with its plain packaging legislation. Has the Malaysian government been in contact with you or any of your colleagues in the government?
Well, not with me and not to the best of my knowledge with the government, but I think this just shows the lengths to which big tobacco are determined to go to stop the government introducing plain packaging in Australia. But we're very determined that this is a public health measure which will have an enormous benefit, and we won't be frightened off because big tobacco are hiring lobbyists or trying to look at different ways to influence the action that we're taking.
Whether or not it's the case, do you acknowledge that it seems more than a coincidence that it's Malaysia that's being lobbied, not any other country? And of course Malaysia right now you're in crucial negotiations with over the asylum seeker swap.
Well, look, I think that's a question you'd have to ask the big tobacco companies. It's their business who they will employ and who they want to lobby. We've seen them very aggressively taking lots of different angles. We've just been able to uncover today and discussed in the Parliament that British American Tobacco has spent 97% of its political donations last year on the Liberal and National Party in Australia. So they're looking for all sorts of ways to influence the debate. I hope that the Liberal and National Party do come on board and support this measure, but certainly the tobacco companies are spending a lot of money in a lot of different ways to try to influence the outcome in our Parliament. Do
you think they're likely to be successful, if not in influencing the outcome with you, then in succeeding in getting countries, particularly countries in the region, to lobby you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, the laws that other countries make for their countries is a matter for them, and I would think most countries would think the laws that we are making for our country are a matter for us. In fact, we've received quite a lot of international support for this. The US Secretary for Health has made very positive comments about the steps that we're taking. The European Union is looking closely and has encouraged us in going down this path. The WHO, the World Health Organization, of course, recommends this as actions that states should consider. So I think there's actually quite a lot of international support for what we're doing. That won't stop those who oppose us, namely big tobacco, for trying everything that they can.
You talk about the US there, and of course we've also heard tonight that members of the US Congress have written to the government, in particular Donald Manzullo. Now, he's no ordinary member of Congress, he's on the Committee on Foreign Affairs. How many letters has the government received from members of the US Congress?
Look, I don't think there's been large numbers. Of course, we've been out with our plain packaging legislation. There's been an exposure draft. We've been very public about what we intend to do. Members of the public in Australia are able to put forward their views, and of course, if other countries or other organisations have views, they're welcome to put them forward too. But we're Australian. We can make countries in Australia to protect Australians, and I think it's neither here nor there if particular congressmen or parliamentarians in other parts of the world don't like what we're doing.
Is it really neither here nor there, though, when you have a look at someone like Donald Manzullo in this letter, and I'll quote from it, it says, Australia's plain packaging proposal legally abrogates sanctioned trademark rights. Not only does it violate Australia's global trade obligations and undermine trademark protection, it also has the negative effect of emboldening governments less committed to intellectual property right protection to dismiss global trade rules. You can't get much plainer or more serious than that.
Well, we fundamentally disagree with that view. We are absolutely confident that the steps we're taking are consistent with our international obligations. None of our international obligations say that we are not permitted to act in the interests of public health and the community. So obviously this is a matter that big tobacco have signalled they will fight. They will probably fight in the courts. They obviously have friends across the world that they will try to influence. Unfortunately, it looks like they also have friends in the Australian Parliament because they're very actively trying to influence the Liberal and National parties.
But are you saying that Donald Manzullo is basically in the pocket of the industry? Do you think that's where this is coming from?
I don't know. I think that the language that is being used is exactly the same language as the tobacco companies. Now, that might be coincidence. That might be because there is a meeting of minds. I don't know. The point I'm making is we're very confident that the steps we're taking are consistent with our legal obligations and our international obligations.
And I'll have a look at that legal advice in a minute, but we are talking about here a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the US. And if you look at that sentence, for example, the issue of where we may be encouraging others basically not to comply with law. I mean, they're very serious threats. He also goes on to talk about how effective intellectual property protection and enforcement is a major element underpinning the support of Congress for free trade agreements, including the Australia-US FTA. I mean, isn't there an element of threat in that?
Look, I don't read it as a threat. I read it as a strongly expressed view, one that we don't agree with. Now, that is appropriate if people have that view. We live in a democracy and people can express it. But our government has made a determined decision that this is what we're going to do. We've got clear advice that we are able to do this. And what we're seeing, I believe, is the big tobacco companies trying to play every trick they can. They've been out asserting that crime gangs will take over the country. They've been asserting that young people will smoke more tobacco because they'll be forced to reduce their prices and profits. We've seen them challenging the intellectual property rights. We've seen them donating large amounts of money to try to influence the political debate here. This is going to be a rough and tumble debate.
But all that said,
we are determined that we're doing the right thing.
But all that said, big tobacco complaining and challenging is one thing. A major trading partner being very specific about how they consider this action, isn't that an entirely different question?
Well, I think you are jumping here to a very, very big conclusion. One person writing a letter which you have obtained is not the US government making a representation to Australia. The US Secretary for Health is on the public record congratulating us for the work that we are doing. I take those comments very seriously.
Can you read those comments, though, as meaning that you're not going to be transgressing our obligations under World Trade rules?
Well, we've got our own advice that we are complying with our international obligations, but I think it is, you cannot look at a comment or a letter that a parliamentarian in Australia makes and say that that is the view of the Australian nation. I think that you are making too big a leap here, and when there is evidence that is to the contrary, that is the Secretary of State welcoming these moves, I think that's a pretty big leap.
Your legal advice, you say you're very confident, and yet other countries, other jurisdictions that have looked at this, I mean, for example, the US hasn't gone down this path. Canada and the UK says it's now going to reconsider it, but certainly in the past, when they've looked at it, when Canada's looked at it, they have decided that one of the key issues is whether or not it would amount to an infringement of intellectual property rights. And indeed, the Canadian Health Minister went into Parliament and quite firmly said that it did. So I'm curious as to what your legal advice is that is so different to the advice that has been given to many other jurisdictions who have sought advice on this subject.
Well, again, I think it's making some sweeping comments here. We have sought advice. We have been provided with advice that makes clear that we are within our rights, both internationally and domestically, to take this action. It is action that requires a significant amount of political will. Not every other country is going to make a decision at any point in time that they can do that. We believe we can. We've led the world on tobacco control legislation in the past. We would be leading the world again and breaking new ground, but we think we're on very strong legal ground, even though we're breaking that new ground. And I think you're seeing a lot of countries readdressing whether they can do this. And in fact, I noticed a press release recently from one of the provinces in Canada saying they were introducing plain packaging. So I think you're seeing different things happening at different points in time, none of which stops us from taking this action.
So what is the legal advice? Because certainly under the WTO there is a commitment that the use of a trademark in the course of trade shall not be unjustifiably encumbered. How do you get an exemption from that? On what grounds?
Well, there's very clear grounds that you can act in accordance with public health. Almost every international obligation that you have has exemptions to it. You even quoted yourself in that language, can't unjustifiably. Obviously, they're the sorts of arguments that people will mount. Now, I'm not here to make a legal case. I'm not here as a barrister or a silk. I'm here as a member of the government that's based on its advice that it's taken, is determined to take this step to protect and try to reduce the harm caused by tobacco in Australia. Tobacco smoking still kills 15,000 people every year, and we think this is a step worth taking if we can reduce that number.
You do expect legal challenges, though?
Well, big tobacco companies have made absolutely clear that they will challenge this. We know that they will fight tooth and nail. You're seeing that played out now across the nation. And I think what the big tobacco companies are doing with all this very noisy huffing and puffing is making clear to most of the community their fears that this measure will work. It will affect their profits, and that means it will save lives. So that's why we're so determined to keep going.
They will fight tooth and nail. Obviously, it's going to get extremely expensive. How much have you budgeted for to take this legal action to its logical conclusion?
Well, we've budgeted to introduce this measure. That includes the consultation. It, of course, includes getting legal advice. It, of course, includes a range of things.
Fighting a court case?
I think your listeners... you think your listeners might be, and viewers, might be interested to know about the billions of dollars that we currently spend every single year treating diseases caused by tobacco. There is no way in the world the most expensive legal case in the country could cost as much as we spend week in, week out fixing up the damage caused from tobacco. So this is, if it was just a financial question, it would be a no-brainer. It's much more than that, but that isn't enough to put us off taking this action.
What happens to duty-free under this legislation? Because, of course, that would still be highly branded and cheaper.
Yeah, look, there are a range of issues that are quite difficult on the edges. Any tobacco that is sold in Australia will be covered by this legislation. So duty-free products that are sold in Australia would be covered by it. I think there is
So they'd have to be plain packaged as well?
Yes, they would. That's my advice.
What about if you bought it in Bangkok and bought it in?
Yeah, well then that's going to be an area where we can't, through our legislation, seek to regulate the way products are sold in other countries, and we don't attempt to do that. We attempt to make sure that we can cover the tobacco that is sold here in Australia. There are, of course, restrictions on the amount of tobacco that can be brought in if you buy it in another place. So, this has to be taken step at a time. There are some difficult issues and practical issues that will be worked through. That's why we've gone through this consultation process, released an exposure draft. While there is a plan to introduce the legislation in the coming months, it wouldn't start till the 1st of January next year, and there's a soft 6-month lead-in time. So we're aware of the practical challenges that need to be dealt with, but they're all ones that are not beyond our wit and we think are worth sorting through.
After cigarettes, and you did say if it was just a financial question it would be a no-brainer, would you consider extending it to other products where there are significant health risks and health costs? Alcohol is the obvious one.
No, look, we don't have any plans to do that, and I think the difference that people need to understand is we have years and years of evidence now about the harm that tobacco causes. There is not a single or small amount of tobacco that it is safe to smoke. It is a killer product. There is no other legal product that is on sale that currently so much is known about the damage that it unequivocally causes. This is a dramatic step. We don't back away from that, but there is a clear case for it for tobacco. There is not a similar case that's been made for any other product.
Nicola Roxon, many thanks for talking to Lateline tonight.
It's a pleasure.